All right, hey everybody. I was criticized today for not making enough content, so I'm gonna do my best to make up for that. In another conversation with someone else, they brought up that 7% of us are gonna die. Well, not exactly, but they said that the death rate for COVID in Canada is 7%. And it seemed like they were pretty frightened about this. And so I asked for them to show me the data, and I did a little bit of analysis, and I did some other similar analysis with other geolocales. And so essentially they were saying that from the cases that we've detected, we have a certain number of deaths, and that's the death rate. And so when people see this, it's a little bit misleading, right? Because so much attention is drawn to it and the media hypes it up constantly, hyping up however they can the fear and the fact that we need to pay close attention to them so that we can find out important information that's going to help us survive. And reporting these case numbers, we'll get into the case numbers, but just to show a death rate of 7% from the cases where we know that they have only limited number of tests to begin with. So if you were to consider that the nation only had a size of the number of those that had been tested, then yes, that death rate would be accurate. But we know, and I'm sure that I'm going to get a lot of flack for talking about extrapolation, but I mean, it is perhaps not accurate to extrapolate, but it's also not accurate to assume these numbers based on the cases that we have detected so far. So if we have a 7%, this is for Canada, I'm going to pull this up here on my cell phone. So for Canada, 71,486 cases, a supposed death rate of 7%, but a test rate of 5.7%. So with Canada having about, I think it was about 37 million number of people, a population of 37 million, that is an extrapolated case number of 2,142,630. So 2 million, and if you apply that same number of deaths, the same number of deaths to this new number of extrapolated cases, you go from 7% death rate to 0.24% for an adjusted death rate. And you know, that's worse than the flu. That's quite a bit worse than the flu, but it's at least an order of magnitude, and you know, depending on which locality you're looking at, maybe even 2 orders less severe than what we're focusing on. So obviously, if you're focusing on a world where you're going to die, or there's like a 10% chance you're going to die, or you're looking at the number of recovered versus the number of dead, then it looks almost like a 1/3 chance you're going to die, maybe without thinking about it clearly or thinking about it reasonably, but just seeing this number as a flashed figure, which is happening constantly. Let's look at California. So California, there was a test there, there was a study there at Stanford, which was kind of revealing, but also received a lot of flack. They were saying that they didn't have perfect methodology and that it's misleading to look at their results. But if we want to talk about what can be determined, we know that they have a certain number of tests and that they have a positive test rate that is similar to most places. We keep on seeing around 5 to 7% of a positive rate, and California is no different. It's 6.7%. That's comparable to Canada with 5.7%. Obviously, they're very different locales, different demographics, different material properties, different environment, different weather, different everything, different biodiversity. But we do see that there's these similarities constantly. California, there's 71,141 cases, supposed death rate of 4%, but a positive test rate of 6.7% of those tested. So if you extrapolate that, there's that word again, we have 2,647,170 extrapolated cases. So more than 2.5 million. If you adjust there, it drops the death rate from 4% to 0.11%. And I don't understand why we should be paying so much attention to these death rates of 4% and 7% and not thinking what it would actually be adjusted for in the real world after we have all the data, which hopefully is not going to be difficult to deduce in the future with questionable methodologies and perhaps a little bit of opportunism. That would be putting it lightly. That would be a very charitable interpretation, but let's keep it to that for now. We made a decision based on this expectation that there were going to be that there's an actual death rate close to these figures that they're still espousing, but what they don't talk about is that they don't actually represent the number of cases, and they don't actually represent the percentage chance that you're going to die. And so if you're busy thinking with that veil, thinking through that lens, then you will not be, you won't be able to see logically through this. You'll just be thinking about how to survive. And we need to do better than that, because without reason, then we're just going to be slaves. So we need to start thinking clearly about this, because obviously there's going to be other repercussions if we don't make changes and if we don't start to integrate with our environment. And I'm pretty sure that all the experts agree that herd immunity is a thing, and it's something that we want to pursue. It's something in our best interest, and that there is no herd immunity if you're not integrated in the environment. And at the moment, people aren't integrating, they're isolating, they're hiding, they're not interacting, they're not having that exchange and recalibration of their microbiotic demographic, their microbiome. And as such, they're also going to be less prepared for adaptation. Let's talk about why we started all this. We made a decision that was together, so to speak. And I say that because although there's legislators and policymakers, I mean, let's be honest here, I don't think anybody wanted for nothing to be done, because most people had concerns. People are seeing these videos of bodies spazzing out in China, videos of some lady who has collapsed over some vegetables in a market in Wuhan, people that are getting pulled into quarantine vans, and some pretty serious draconian measures being taken. And obviously, why would the state of China wish to invite more criticism than they need? Obviously, they must be performing these actions with some kind of reasonable intent. But regardless, we had a rising sentiment of fear and uncertainty here, seeing these things, and an increasing reluctance, even resentment, about having to go to a workplace, about having to expose yourself, and also resentment for the potential that your loved ones are being exposed to these things. And so policymakers responded to this, obviously to the pressure of people's opinion, but also to other pressures. There's organizational pressures, there's other international authoritative bodies and their standards and their recommendations, and that's going to reflect on your competence as a legislator and as a representative of your constituents. And there's competition there, because your position is temporary, and you are competing against other politicians, and you have to hold office, and you can't really do your work if you don't have office. So it would make sense that they need to respond, and they have to do it in the immediate. And there's always going to be some limitation temporally in terms of how far ahead you're looking, because a term is a term. And so they're not necessarily making their decisions because of their scientific knowledge. It's a conglomeration of these factors. It's partially that they're receiving scientific opinion and some data and some guidance in terms of how they can best hold office and maintain it. And also, we need to be real here, but most politicians or people that are in that realm of political science are not necessarily from a background where they are worried about basic survival. They have the means to be thinking about governing, about governance, about how to engineer the appropriate social sphere for the best benefit of all, and maybe for whatever represents their values in their world. So there is a tendency, or at least there is a potential, to overreact because of not having dealt with real threat to one's life. And that might influence decisions here, we don't know. But also that they want to respond in a way that has a high percentage chance of falling within a range of normalcy. And given that there's so many unknowns here, an unknown threat, unknown circumstances, and also that it is a novel situation, they want to do what is probably going to be the most common type of response, so that they don't end up being an edge case where they have a higher chance of inviting criticism. But nevertheless, this was responding to our needs, and that makes sense. So our perspective at the time was that we needed safety from a deadly threat, and there was a lot of focus on the number of cases. And as time goes on and we understand what those cases mean and how many real cases there are, there should have been an adjustment in terms of how these things are reported and how politicians speak of them. But of course, we can't expect the media to change that because, they need the clicks, they need to stay relevant. And politicians, well, if suddenly they've been able to expand their powers and that is the new normal, then it's really difficult to give that up. I mean, that's just a natural, maybe a tendency of systems, but it's also a human characteristic that you get used to something that is rewarding you, and you need to maintain that. We were also looking at the number of recovered versus the number of infected, and the number of dead versus the number of recovered. And when you see that, it almost looks like a 1/3 chance that you're going to die, and that's not the case. But that you need to at least be cognizant of the fact that when you're looking at those figures, that might be how your mind is interpreting it, and that might be circumventing your faculties of reason. So keep that in mind when you're looking at all these crazy figures. We also wanted to ensure that the systems aren't going to be overrun, because you want there to be a bed for you when this shit hits you and you suddenly can't breathe. But of course, like we've seen from extrapolated numbers, even if you were to have them, the chance that you're going to be in that situation, unless you have a lot of comorbidities and you are maybe in the end of your life, it's probably not going to be that case. You probably won't notice that you had the symptoms, or they'll be so minute that you would think that it could have been any other normal ailment that you are accustomed to withstanding. But in hindsight, it's not as deadly as once believed. I mean, that shouldn't be controversial. I mean, we were expecting at least some overrunning, and although there's hot spots, and although there's some horror stories which we hear in the media and they receive all the focused attention, let's be real here. It's not like the Black Death. It's not the bubonic plague. It's not anywhere near the numbers of the pandemic flu of 1918, 1919. So we should at least have the conversation that, okay, well, maybe, we had a response, and now we need to think about what the other possible threats could be. And we also want to retain our approach to adopting some kind of herd immunity. And if we are isolating ourselves, you are going to become emotionally and physically more fragile. You'll become less accustomed to integrating with the real world and having to face all the kinds of threats that it has to offer. And we know that fragility long-term is going to lead to other possible disasters. So let's not be overly fragile. Let's think about how we can live our lives. We also know that there's not a standard methodology for aggregating the data. And what I mean is that there are standards in terms of how we assess and determine a cause of death. And generally speaking, I'll give you an example. My father, when he died, he had cancer for many years. And he had, I guess, he was given like a 12 months to live or something like that when he was first diagnosed. And he kept it up for a good 5.5 years. And so by the time he died, obviously there are all kinds of problems and there's all kinds of symptoms. And at the time that he died with a respiratory infection, which is kind of normal. I mean, we are like breathing machines, right? So if you get sick, you should expect that you're going to have some sort of suffocation coming at the end of that. And in a lot of cases, if your body is not operating properly, if you're not able to clear phlegm, if you're not able to take normal breaths, then a respiratory infection probably accompanies some of those symptoms at the end of your life, regardless of, well, maybe if you're lucky to be pulverized instantly, that might not be the case. But if you have a heart attack or you've had a stroke and you're in bed for a couple weeks, barely able to move, you're probably going to get some respiratory infections. And so when his death was assessed, they said cancer. And at the time I was a bit naive and I was like, well, wait a minute. I could see that he had a respiratory infection. There was all this stuff coming out, and definitely he's been struggling with that in his last few days. So shouldn't technically the cause of death be a respiratory infection by some pathogen? But of course I was wrong. And it was cancer, because I mean, that's the normal standard that they apply and to make those determinations. And they do that for all sorts of diseases. That is the normal case with other pulmonary diseases, influenza virus, pneumonia as a whole. And we should expect that when something novel occurs, we shouldn't make the standard more permissive. And we do know that it is more permissive because we've heard from public health officials, we've heard from, in the United States, the advisor to Trump there, Burke, she was saying that they do count all COVID-related deaths as COVID deaths. So, and we've also heard from doctors that they are advised from the CDC that if you have a reasonable expectation that COVID is involved, that you mark it as a COVID death. So we necessarily have figures that have to be inflated to some degree. We can be charitable about it and ignore it and just look at the extrapolated numbers, and we can have those. And if we have those and don't consider the changes in terms of the standard of making those determinations of what is designated a COVID death, then even then the numbers are nowhere near as deadly as what we were expecting. And of course you could say that this is because we've self-isolated, but we do know that as much as you can't compare the differences of one locale versus another, given that there are similar numbers within a degree, but in terms of like within a range of an order of magnitude or less, we do know that the numbers are similar in all places. So we should still consider that in those places where they didn't take these kinds of, let's call them draconian measures, like in Korea, like in Sweden, they have similar numbers, and although the numbers might be a little bit higher, or arguably in Sweden, they are going to have herd immunity sooner, which means that they won't be dealing with the after effects as severely as maybe some other places where people have become more fragile. So let's not be more fragile. Let's not wait for the potential of increasing the extremities of behavior to arise. We want to keep things within a range that is good for our future. And if we want to do that, then we have to stop being afraid and start thinking about living our lives and integrating with our environment. So yeah, that's a good for now.